Chapter 23. Color in the Visible and Invisible World. Part 1. All that exists, the whole visible universe, is a manifestation of force, of vibratory energy differentiated not by velocity alone but by form. And every form has its color, as also its tone, or sound. Thus certain colors are inseparably associated with certain forms of vibration, and, consequently, with conditions of substance. The color is in the substance, whether there be light by which to see it or all is darkness. For example, the potency of a drug or herb may be recognized by its color, and it will have exactly the same effect if administered in the dark as if taken in broadest daylight. Moreover, the form in which it is prepared may entirely conceal its normal color, for the great solvent Apos, water, has the power to hold the color latently, but therein lies its power. In therapeutic color treatment chromopathy, the patient continues through the darkness of the night to receive the restorative harmonizing vibrations of the color by which he is surrounded. And the effect of that color is from its explicit action upon the human sheaves. In chemical research, the hints which color gives are but half understood, and throughout the scientific world its power and mystery are greatly depreciated. In the chemical changes of atoms, all variations of colors indicate fundamental differences in either their constitution or their phase, whether positive or negative. Dr. Babbitt's investigations led him to conclude that the positive, or active, color was always within the atom, and the negative, or passive, without. But to my understanding this is only a half-truth, describing one atomic phase, and it is not corroborated by occult study, clairvoyant, which distinguishes ultimate physical atoms by their direction of motion, the ever-spiral force moving from right to left in the positive, and from left to right in the negative, the former pouring out force and the latter receiving it. See bibliography. There are as many grades, shades, and hues of color as of musical tones and combinations of geometrical forms. So the further we go from the so-called primaries of red, yellow, and blue, the more intricate, baffling, and mysterious are these color relations. Blue has been called the negative in nature which holds all things. Now, replacing blue with indigo, we have an occult truth. From the earliest ages, Eastern philosophers have associated indigo with the spiritual, or higher mind of man, the causal body. But the curious properties of indigo have always been as well known to the practical dyer as to the occultist. It is lighter than any known liquid, and as long as it retains its color and nature, it is insoluble even in ether. Therefore, the dyer must extract the blue by means of deoxidation. In this process, called setting the blue VAT, indigo gives us a perfect object lesson of the transformation in a substance according to its negative or positive conditions. When being made soluble, indigo loses its apparent color in proportion as the oxygen departs, becoming perfectly white in solution. Goods dipped in the white liquid are then hung in the air, when they swiftly turn blue as the indigo in them is oxidized. Repeated immersion in the blue VAT gives every shade of blue from sky to navy, as long as dyeing remained an art, until commercialized by the introduction of aniline dyes. Indigo was considered the only real blue dye. The woad of Gaul and Britain was a northern indigo and acted similarly, and with red, yellow, and brown, furnished the dyer with the natural substances from which he could make all the shades, tints, and hues his art required. As you know that the earth vibration, Prithivic, is yellow, it is of interest in this study of the tattvas to add one bit more of dyer's law. Herbs which yield yellow dyes are the commonest ones in forest and field. They were called by our forefathers greening weeds, because green was obtained by dyeing the stuff first in the indigo VAT, and then greening it to the desired shade in yellow dye. Now, Just as Akasha is the omnipresent tattva, synthesizing all others, so indigo corresponds with Akasha not merely symbolically, but because it is Akashic, a Prithivic form of Akasha, and holds other colors in synthesis. You understand that the 7 colors of the solar spectrum, so-called prismatic colors, distinguish the 7 logo one from another. Hence they are emanations from and manifest the characteristics of the 7 hierarchies of being, each of which, says Madame Blavatsky, has a direct bearing upon and relation to one of the human principles, since each of these hierarchies is, in fact, the creator and source of the corresponding principle. This statement confirms all the planetary correspondences and influences explained in earlier chapters, as every hierarchy is itself septenary, containing the 7 colors of the spectrum. The permutations in colors are myriad, but the ruling or distinguishing color of a hierarchy gives the hue to that septenary, for its influence is paramount. This is the primary source of all the tattvic permutations and comminglings. To this infinite gamut of color in the realm of nature, the solar spectrum itself bears witness. For long ago, Sir David Brewster succeeded in counting not 7 only but 2,000 Fraunhofer lines which registered as many distinct tints and hues of color. Only the tattvic law can explain these, as visualizing the varied geometrical forms of etheric vibrations. The 7 prismatic colors correspond to simple or primary forms, and their infinite variations to permutations of these. As of everything throughout the cosmos, there is septenary division and progression of races. And, as is quite generally understood, we are the 5th subrace of the 5th root race. We are in the 4th round of this evolutionary cycle. That is, our globe is at the lowest arc of the planetary chain, the deepest involution of spirit in matter, and the period of the fullest development of pure intellect. A combination that has produced the gross materialist, the intellectual giants and soul. But it is of profound significance that we are far past the middle of the round. Thus all is preparing for the 5th round, in which matter will lose its density. Why? Because faculties will be developed that enable man to perceive the withinness of all things. In occultism, there is no above as no below, but an eternal within 2 other withins, or planes of subjectivity merging gradually into that of terrestrial objectivity, this being for man the last one, his own plane. Just as every thought has form and consequently color, so sounds which, are differentiated one from another by form, have their distinguishing colors, hues, and tints. Speech, which is sound in this physical world, echoes as color in the astral sphere around us and has its influence. All the wonderful harmony of color that delights our eyes has its correspondence with an inaudible harmony of sounds. The entrancing colors of nature, the blue dome of the sky, the violet and purple of distant mountain heights, the green cadences of forest and meadow, the gold of the sunlit fields of ripening grain, the red of the igneous rocks and the fresh-turned earth. All these are the visible tones of the harmony of the sphere. The totality of the 7 rays, says me, Blavatsky, spread through the solar system, constitute, so to say, the physical upadhi, basis, of the ether of science. To the 7th sense, these inaudible sounds will be as perceptible as are the colors of musical tones to the clairvoyant now. The rudiments of the sense of sound exist in the minutest fragments of the universe. The subtle space granules Sukshma Akshara are everywhere. Sound is inherent in them, not to be dissilated from them. But the sound varies, as you know, according to the form of the vibrations moving through this all-pervading space. It enwraps and penetrates even the minutest conceivable atom in the proportion of being greatly in excess of that atom. And color attends and irradiates this marvelous world of activity. the perfected man who has evolved these higher senses, and woe to him if he misuse them. His fall will be abysmal. Comes into possession of 7 soul senses, 3 so to speak, corresponding with the physical senses, but as much finer and more subtle in their vibratory force as the soul is higher than the body. It is these spiritual senses that will carry us beyond gross matter. The soul senses corresponding with the 6th and 7th are the ability to recognize true inspiration, and the capacity to know the truth of being. That is, to communicate with spiritual intelligences in the wordless spaces of Akasha, or spirit space, which is the knowledge space of Swami Vivekananda. Not words but color and thoughts communicate ideas on this plane, and their vibrations are of varying degrees of subtlety. For every plane follows the fundamental law of septenary unfoldment. It is a region of marvelous color, etherealized, luminous colors of exquisite rainbow hues, ripple and flow with inconceivable velocity, not to be compared to anything upon the physical plane. Here is the light that never was on sea or land. The invisible world is radiant with it. Dr. Babbitt calls it psychic light, the direct messenger and servant of the spirit in its relations to the outward world. He further affirms that these psychic colors reveal the primary laws of force, and it was upon these that he based his wonderful and successful system of color therapeutics, principles of light and color. There are from 8 to 10 octaves of color in sunlight, of which not quite one is visible to ordinary human eyes. But culture improves the range of even physical vision, as artistic training constantly gives proof. Realize now that man is compounded of all these forces, being an aggregation of atoms through varied combinations and permutations, forming a center of the highest activity, through and upon which these myriad forces play continually. These forces are therein further transformed and pass out as evil or beneficent influences, according to the use man has made of them, to find their affinity in other centers. Up to this point, though you have studied only the 5-fold nature of the tattvas, every opportunity has been seized to impress upon you that they are vehicles for a higher, directing and overruling force, that they are differentiated forms of that one dual force. We have found correspondence of the tattvas from Prithivic to Akasha with 5 of the human sheaths, but there are 7 sheaths. The logical mind at once demands, are there not then 7 tattvas? Yes or no, according to the definition we give the word. If we restrict it to an elemental condition of matter, there are but 5. If we adhere to our higher signification, a form of motion, that is, force within substance, there are 7. In the Upanishads, emphasis is everywhere given to the 5 elements, and when a 6th principle is mentioned, it is consciousness or understanding. If 7 are enumerated, both of these faculties are included. Thus power of choosing and directing is always implied. In the Dharma Shastra, this explicit statement is made. With the minute particles of the 5 perishable elements, every existing thing has been formed in its sequence and order. Who or what is the former? The highest principle. This is a very clear distinction which should be kept in mind. Intuitionally, we know there must be 7 forces corresponding with the 7 sheaths. So we seek to identify the 2 upper sheaths with what the fine inner sense has foreseen, the omnipresent spirit, Atma, and its individualized ray, the human soul, the forces behind all force, and penetrating all. Thus, the 6th and 7th tattvas correspond to body and Atma, soul and spirit. The latter is described by me, Blavatsky, as the auric envelope impregnated with the light of Atma. Naturally, these 2 higher tattvas are as concealed from the average mortal as are the 6th and 7th senses from the materialistic mind. For just as Akasha, the all-pervading ether of space, has become cognizable only to comparatively recent science, and is yet but half understood, a baffling paradox, so men generally cannot yet grasp the power and significance of the higher principles and the planes of consciousness to which they will lead. Until shortly before she was taken from her work here, Blavatsky was not permitted to reveal any information concerning the tattvas. The embargo was, however, removed in time for her to state some facts in the appendix to the 3rd volume of the Secret Doctrine, where she gives the names and powers of the higher tattvas. She explains, the doctrine of the 7 tattvas, the principles of the universe and also of man, was held in great sacredness and, therefore, secrecy in days of old, by the Brahmins, who have now almost forgotten the teachings. Yet it is taught to this day in the schools beyond the Himalayan range. The 6th tattva is anubdhika, described as the first differentiation on the plane of being, or that which is born by transformation from something higher than itself. It is the first garment, or sheath, of the spirit, and the color is said to be yellow. This, I believe, is its positive phase, and that negatively it is violet, which identifies it with Mercury, whose phases correspond. The 7th tattva is Adi, the primordial universal force. It is the vehicle containing potentially all things spirit, substance, force and matter. In esoteric cosmogony, says Madame Blavatsky, it is the force which we refer to as proceeding from the first or unmanifested logos, spiritual substance. The Sanskrit meaning of the word is first, and in the Upanishads, Adi is described as the first, i.e., Om, as nearly as we can comprehend in our present stage of evolution. This highest principle is a ray, a spark from God's self, which permeates the entire being, radiating from center to circumference. This makes perfectly clear and realizable St. Paul's affirmation that he be not far from every one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. This one outgoing energy is differentiated in the sheath, but not in itself. It is the will of God, and man's will, when controlled by wisdom and understanding, shares in this spiritual power. This is the conquest of the Argus of fate. If you comprehend what this implies, you will be convinced beyond the possibility of forgetting that higher monas, well named the causal body, has power to mold every cell, molecule, and atom in the lower sheaves to whatever measure of purity and harmony the soul may dictate. Monas is spiritual self-consciousness in itself, and divine consciousness when united with body, but only through a spirit of aspiration and self-consecration to the highest can this union of Atma Buddhi Monas be attained, and realize for us the full activity of the spirit. You already realize that the physical self, which you know best, is a sensitive harp played upon by myriads of vibrating waves. The principles, or sheaves, are the tones in the human octave, and the individual keynote is the tone and has the color of the principle most highly developed. The self clearly proclaims itself, its stage of progress or evolution, through the colors which permeate it through and radiate in its enveloping aura. Chapter 24. Color in the Visible and Invisible World, Part 2. It is important to understand very clearly what is the personal responsibility for the key to which the self responds. When this is comprehended and kept in mind, the frequent objections to the public teaching of these truths of being, which hastens the evolution of the soul as nothing else can, and the periodical alarm cries concerning the dangers attending the practice of yoga breathing exercises, will entirely cease, for they will be recognized as baseless, the utterance either of ignorance or misdirected caution, both of which retard the advancement of the race. In a very learned work, Phenomena in Spiritual Being, translated from the Tamil by Sri Ramanathan, it is stated, Not until the day of the flesh, the days during which love of sensuous enjoyment prevails, has completely passed will Tarodhana Shakti, veiling power, manifest itself as Para Shakti, all-illumining power, but it depends upon ourselves, upon our desires and thoughts we permit to cherish and nourish these, how long the day of the flesh shall endure. Further, 'tis said, the giver of all knowledge, the great teacher of the universe, therefore withholds knowledge till the time of maturity arrives, yes. But we hasten or retard that time by every thought and act. To know the responsibility is to know the penalty for disregarding it. Evasion is utterly impossible. Here is the safeguard against misuse of power. In the Upanishads we read that the human body made by the gods, Sephiroth, is the divine lute. That made by man himself is an imitation of it. The fingers of the divine lute correspond with the strings of the man-made, and we tighten or loosen them. We tune them to harmony or leave them to jangle ourselves. Discords are self-made. Remember that the individual key and color depend upon the predominant sheaths, or principles, while the strongest influence upon this is the composition of the pranic currents at the hour of birth. That is, the exact hue or tint of the hierarchy ruling the moment. The tattvic state of the currents in the hierarchy and flowing thence determining this. You have learned that the dominant thoughts of the mind and the consequent activities of the life have an overwhelming influence in modifying and changing these. There is no evil which has not its opposite good, and every key can be transmuted into good. Misuse and ignorance create all evil. Irritability in the temperament makes a scarlet cloud in the Kama Rupa, frequently alluded to as the astral body, which is the plane of vivid emotions and passions. And every outburst of temper suffuses the whole sheath. When the tempest of passion dies away, the color fades out, but ever leaves a little more, a larger cloud of the passion taint. And all the atoms of that principle are more susceptible to greater heat and excitement upon the next occasion of loss of self-control. All actions, both good and bad, are thus received by the various vehicles and reflected in them, changing the hue of the color from moment to moment. And thus man forms his habits and from them builds his character. Live, sentient atoms, pulsing with his thought, being the bricks and mortar of his structure. Very fortunately the causal body rejects all evil, which stamps itself only upon the lower and less permanent sheaves, the matter of which has greater affinity for evil. All good and uplifting influences are steadily stored up in the causal body, making it stronger and more powerful to overcome, and thus the evolution of the soul goes on in spite of man's waywardness. So the tones and consequently the colors of the human lute are irrefutable manifestations of what the self is making and molding out of the opportunities of this life, for they indicate his varied states, physical, mental, and spiritual. Thus the tone and color body of man reflects the man himself as in a mirror. This is the unvarying law of color, which ever and always betrays the media through which it flows, and the substance whence it emanates. And according to the prevalent color of the individual is that individual played upon and affected by the color in the external world. For color produces sound and sound produces color, the interaction of the two being invariable. The quality of a principle is, of course, conditioned by the elements which compose it, and these give it a distinguishing color. But the shade or hue and character and disposition depend much upon this is determined by the number of its atoms, not considered in multiple or quantity, but in grade from 1 to 7 degrees of subtlety or density. For every principle has its septenary divisions of tattvic permutations, and this varies the order of the colors. The physiological effect of the excess or deficiency of the normal color of a principle is profound, and every disturbance of a tattva causes exactly such disorder. The difference in the effect of such disturbance upon different persons brings out in strong relief asterisks for interesting physical experiments proving this law. See Mrs. Besant's Building of the Cosmos, 274. The law of the rhythmic breath, the planetary influences which determine temperament and characteristics. For every principle, simply reflecting the power of its ruling hierarchy and tattva, which works always in the matter of that sheath, has its special sayat of influence in the human body, and exactly according to the so-called accidents of birth. There is no chance. All is the effect of a given cause. Primarily is a man prone to disorders of the head or feet, the heart or lungs, the stomach or liver, etc. But all these so-called hereditary weaknesses can be overcome by healthful living and more healthful thinking. Thought being preeminently the molding power of evolution, as it was in the beginning of involution. Voltaire said, as the sum of 40 years searching for truth, chance is a word void of sense. The world is arranged according to mathematical laws. Every organ in the body is the center of a certain power, and it is upon the perfection of its function and the harmonious cooperation of all these powers that the well-being and usefulness of the individual, his growth and development to high purpose, depends. We are held under the law, by evil, not by good. In the life of the spirit we are freed and make laws for ourselves. The purity of soul vibration, soul power applied to the regeneration of the body has power to expel many seemingly malignant disorders. Two facts must ever be kept in mind. The duality in all existence, manifested and unmanifested. It is the coexistence of spirit matter, and that all development proceeds primarily by the triadic process, according to the stage of the process, from the creation of a universe to the birth of a human being and the thoughts of his mind, upon which his evolution depends. The color corresponds with and indicates the period, in varying grades marking the critical state, or merging together of positive and negative phases which produce secondary colors, from red through yellow to blue. But, never forget, above these and penetrating and modifying all is a spiritual force, without which they could not exist, which emanates as violet and indigo, for these are its garments. This spirit force, the lowest form of spirit, manifests on the material plane as electricity and magnetism, and is to be identified as a ray from the light of the Logos. Akasha, limiting its form, introducing the principle of division into the one, says Mrs. Besant, veils the light, and by limiting the ray, makes separation, where, essentially, separation there is known. It is these varying phases and tattvic combinations in every hierarchy, planet, element, and corresponding human principle that account for the discrepancies in the many schemes of correspondences between planets, tattvas, elements, and principles. The so-called secondary colors, which are critical states and triadic, are sometimes called neutral points in progression, but they also have their dual phases. Thus violet, which comes forth from the mingling of positive red with negative blue, is the negative neutral, and yellow, which occupies the middle ground between red and blue, is the positive neutral. These two colors represent the corresponding phases of Mercury, and they are preeminent in the aura of an adept during the state of Samadhi when the Kundalini has risen in the Sushumna. Violet really veils the heat and light of the spiritual flame, and derives its potency and delicacy from the exquisitely subtle refinement of this electric fire, which is beyond the comprehension of our finite senses. It is ultraviolet, of course, to which this refers. But all violet is intrinsically the same in nature and in influence. though lowered in degree of power as it is coarsened in descent through lower octaves to visibility. Madame Blavatsky declares numbers in connection with principles are purely arbitrary, changing with every school. Some count 3, some 4, some 6, and some 7. She further explains that they do not follow in regular sequence, and that every student is left by his guru to work out for himself the number appropriate to each of his principles. In a certain sense, this is true. Yet there are correspondences of tone, color, and principle which, however they may vary individually, are best comprehended by assuming a normal order. If we hold in mind the fact that all evolution, all progression, is cyclic or spiral, it will help to a clearer comprehension of some puzzling statements. For degree and number must depend upon the grade, the height on the spiral of the color and key.